Okay, welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk about tricksters, a little bit of a departure from some of our more sort of different theories of myth, people like Carl Jung and all that. We're going to talk about tricksters, and this is pretty fun because I haven't had as much time as I would like to talk about tricksters in previous semesters. So this will be fun to see what we can do here. I don't know how long this particular PowerPoint is going to be, so we're just going to go and see how it goes. But yeah, so for our discussion of tricksters, we're basing it on, especially on chapter 25 of the book, which talks about African trickster stories, and I think we'll be able to tie that into some other tricksters as well, maybe some of which you might already know about or recognize. So that'll be fun to think about. Now you might ask, why are we talking about tricksters? Well, I think they're kind of helpful in understanding heroes. So when we get to heroes and Joseph Campbell, I think tricksters will tie into that. So I think we can build on some of the stuff we've learned from people like Jung and Joseph Campbell. Jung and Levi Strauss, and then we'll use that to kind of to tie into heroes and tricksters in Joseph Campbell. At least that's what I'm thinking. We'll see where we end up with it. But yeah, let's talk about tricksters. Okay, let's see here. So first off, what is a trickster? I would define a trickster as someone in a story who plays a trick on somebody else, who, tricks them in some way, who makes them look like a fool by pulling a prank over on them or something like that. And now sometimes tricksters get tricked themselves, but also you see them kind of moving back and forth between tricking other people and being tricked themselves. So that's kind of interesting. And there's a lot we can say about tricksters and the kind of role they play in all these stories. But the stories have a very similar structure. There's something that the trickster wants to do, and there's somebody who's getting in the way of letting them do it. So what the trickster does is they use their cleverness to trick somebody else, usually because that somebody else is being foolish or greedy in some way. So they take advantage of the way other people are to get what they want. And sometimes that works out well for them, and sometimes it doesn't. Right now are African American trickster stories. These are our ones from the book. There's a lot of different diverse stories in here from the book. They go in a lot of different directions, but they all kind of reflect this tradition of storytelling. So it seems like there was a really strong trickster tradition in Africa, in African folklore, especially in Western Africa, sort of the area of Ghana and whatnot. There was a familiar concept of some kind of trickster character. Sometimes that was the hare, the rabbit, or sometimes that was the spider. And we'll talk about Anansi in a second here. Um, but there was somebody who was able to do these kind of tricks. Usually in the original African culture, it was tricking a great king or someone who had power. That's the thing, is the trickster often is able to trick the guy with power, and the trickster is often the underdog, so you want to root for him at least a little bit. Although sometimes the trickster just does whatever he wants, and you just watch whether or not you're actually rooting for him. But yeah, you have this sort of familiar trickster tradition, but it's not just African stories, but it's kind of around the world that we see tricksters. But in Africa, they became a big part of the culture and really connected with these stories. The stories are kind of in between ideologies explaining the world and fairy tales that have more of that sort of simple structure very often. And a reason we know about a lot of them is a lot of them came over to America in a kind of transformed way because this is one of the dark spots of history, is African slaves were taken to the Americas to work on plantations, not just in the United States, but also in the Caribbean, working on sugarcane and things like that. It's this sort of horrific tragedy and the sort of subjugation of slaves affected the way these stories were going to be told. And so when the stories are retold in America, there's a lot more underdogs that you're rooting for, and it's a lot more about how someone has to kind of play tricks to survive in some way or another. Instead of talking about a king as the guy who gets tricked, very often it's the master. Master is sometimes the name given to the guy who gets tricked, or sometimes it's both, master king. So these are the guys who get tricked. But also the trickster still does end up getting tricked themselves himself quite often. And these stories, they were told in the plantations, on the farms, and were a way for people to have their own culture, and also kind of to pass covert messages. Because on the surface, these stories aren't about, rise up and have a revolution or anything like that, but they are about surviving when the chips are down and when things are really hard and difficult. And in general, a lot of these stories, even in Africa, seem to be about a time when things were difficult, like there was a drought or something like that, and people had to struggle for food, and this is how the trickster decides to get food. So there's a lot of feeling like that could be, useful in this situation as well, where people are trying to figure out how to survive even when they're slaves. Yeah, and there's some famous ones. You might have heard the story of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. These were African American folk tales that became so well known that they became more familiar in white culture as well. Disney even made a movie based off of Brer Rabbit stories at one point. And one of the stories about Brer Rabbit is that is where he gets tricked by the Tar Baby. Another fellow wants to capture him. So the other guy, who in some versions is the fox is trying to trick the trickster rabbit. And so he creates this baby out of tar and just puts clothes on it and sets it out. And Brer Rabbit encounters it and thinks it's a person, and he starts talking to the person, and then he says, "Hey, why don't you talk to me? What's up?" And then he gets really mad, and then he hits the person because he won't talk to him, and then now his hand is stuck to the tar, and he gets really frustrated. And he's like, "Hey, you let go of me!" So he strikes the tar baby with his other hand, and now both his hands are caught. And okay, then he tries to kick the tar baby, and then he gets both his legs caught. And then finally he headsbutts the tar baby, and his whole body is stuck to the tar. In this story, the trickster gets tricked and gets stuck and captured. And this is a classic story. There's like this in Indian mythology as well. That you find this around the world of a sort of a person who you get stuck to, monster or creature or something. So that's when Brer Rabbit gets tricked. And there's another story in the book about a hare who, it's the same thing, is the hare and the tar baby. So this is a more original African of the story. But in this case, we know why the hare deserves it. It's because all the other animals cut off part of their ears to have something to eat, and the hare wouldn't do it. He refused to. That's why he had long ears. So he just tried to steal food from other people. So the other animals got together to try and figure out how to punish him, and that was part of the punishment. And now they chase him around, and now the hare is always running away from people. So that's kind of the origin story here. And then this is the African American version, is Brer Rabbit. But sometimes Brer Rabbit is very successful. For instance, when he's caught, and sometimes it's in this story, sometimes it's in another story, he says, "Whatever you do to me, just don't throw me in the briar patch." Briar patch being this, this sort of tangled bush full of horrible thorns and things. And he keeps saying it over and over and over. "Don't throw me in the briar patch. Don't throw me in the briar patch." And the guy who's captured him thinks he's got him figured out. So he says, "Oh, you don't want to be thrown in the briar patch, huh? I guess that's exactly what I'll do to you." So he throws him in the briar patch, and Brer Rabbit gets away and says, "Ha, you fool! The briar patch is my home. This is where I live. I'm a rabbit. So I live in the briar patch, and I run through it all the time. You're the one who can't go in the briar patch." So that's how the rabbit makes his escape. So that's a more trickster succeeding version of the story. So you can see how there's an inherent ambiguity here. Okay, and I think we have time to talk about Anansi in this video as well. Anansi is probably the most famous of all the African trickster characters. He comes from West African culture especially, but he's also now these days very popular in Jamaica and places like that in the Caribbean. And Anansi is so complicated and so weird in that sometimes he's just depicted as the worst person in the world, but also people love him. So he's a spider. but he can also be a human as well. And the stories don't really make a strong distinction. Nazi's just doing whatever he's doing, whether he's a spider or not. And in a lot of these stories, the animals tend to be somewhere between animals and people. So this is what the spider does on his days off. And yeah, a Nazi will steal from people. He will lie to people. He will cheat from people. He wants to get all the food and all the wealth and all the power for himself. He's a greedy jerk a lot of the time, but you end up kind of rooting for him anyway. And the weird thing is, in spite of being all greedy and stuff, he is also a very important figure to society. He gave people writing. He gave people culture. He taught people how to farm. He taught people how to hunt. So he's like the founder of all these important things in society. But he's also depicted as an extremely lazy spider who just is very opportunistic and sees an opportunity to trick somebody into doing something for him, and he'll totally do it. So that is pretty wild. Yeah, and weirdly, with all this, he is associated with wisdom. So one story is that he had all the wisdom in the world. He kept it in a gourd, the calabash. But there was so much in the gourd that it kept spilling out. He kept spilling the wisdom all over the ground. So eventually he got sick of having all the wisdom, and he decided to just give it to everybody. So now wisdom is just randomly distributed through the world. And that's how wisdom got to be a thing in the world. Yeah, and in many stories, Anansi is tricked himself, and he kind of deserves it. Yeah, if we're trying to figure out why he's associated with wisdom, I think we can maybe explain that in a second here. But Anansi definitely deserves a lot of the dumb things that happen to him. Like he succeeds in tricking somebody, but then karma comes along and he ends up getting tricked himself. So it all comes full circle. And I think maybe the reason why he's associated with wisdom is if you hear one of these stories, you hear about somebody being tricked in this way, whether that's Anansi or that's somebody who's Anansi's fool, who Anansi is tricking, you might think about being more careful about what you do. You might learn not to be fooled by tricks, like Anansi's tricks or the tricks that people play on Anansi. And you might learn from Anansi not to be so greedy or so self-centered, because that's going to be the thing that gets you into trouble. So I think hearing these stories is associated with wisdom because of that, because people are learning from Anansi. So in a sense, Anansi makes so many mistakes, or he causes other people to make mistakes. But that's why the stories give you wisdom. And I think it's kind of like, what we said about myths and fairy tales is sometimes there are stories about what not to do. So that makes Anansi a really powerful figure in this society. And he is said to be the king of stories. He's really strongly associated with stories, and sometimes he tells stories himself. Sometimes he tells big old lies. And often the storyteller who's telling an Anansi story will say, oh, at the end, I am lying completely. First he'll say, oh, I was there, I saw the whole thing. And then he'll say, oh, I'm totally lying. So that's kind of the attitude people have towards Anansi. It's very sort of multifaceted and interesting. And so Anansi's not a good guy, he's not a bad guy, but he's an important guy, and people like him because he's part of culture, and that's why all the important things seem to come from him. So tricksters like Anansi seem to have an ability kind of to write the rules of society, to have a powerful effect on a society even without meaning to. They're not necessarily doing it on purpose, but they end up sort of creating the world that people live in. And very often Anansi stories are explanations for something. Yeah, and there's some great examples in the book with multiple scenes where Anansi's getting tricked, and then he's tricked somebody else to get out of the situation, and it just goes back and forth. And ends up, winning by getting a lot of food for himself. And if all this is sounding familiar, yeah, we looked before at the examples of Raven and Coyote. They usually act out of greed. They don't try to help humanity, but they usually have positive effects for humanity anyway. So they play tricks on people, they cause other people to look like fools, and they're mostly doing it to serve themselves. But in the end, it ends up benefiting humanity and leading to things that human beings consider important. So I guess let's just pause there. And we'll pick that thread up, and look at it in the context of some other stories, including Greek stories.